Hi, this is Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 49 of the Clarinet podcast, the show where I discuss all that's new and neat with clarinet with the neatest people in the industry. In today's episode, I speak to Clark W. Fobes. Now, Clark is world-renowned as a barrel and mouthpiece manufacturer along with other accessories, but you might not know he's also an active player in the San Francisco Bay Area and has even recorded movie soundtracks. Clark shares many interesting details about his barrels, mouthpieces, and even some upcoming products, which I'm really excited about. He also goes into depth about his new 10K mouthpiece and explains to us what it's like to record movie soundtracks in studio. One of the things that really struck me about this interview, other than its length, it actually clocks in to be the longest Clarinet episode yet, at over an hour and a half, but also Clark's really incredible passion, dedication, and also belief in his products. Clark actually believes so much in his products that if you're a qualified teacher, you may be eligible to try his debut mouthpiece free of charge with one of your students in your studio. If you'd like to learn more about this offer, please see the show notes at clarinet.com, and this offer is also ongoing on Clark's website. Please note that it is only valid for continental United States residents. The Clarinet podcast is made possible in part by the support of its listeners. Today, I'd like to thank our latest Patreon backer, John. I'd also like to thank those who have donated using the donate button on the website, and also those who are doing their Amazon shopping through our referral links. This is perhaps the best way to help out the podcast, since there's no additional cost to you. You simply do your shopping as normal, and a small percentage goes towards the ongoing production of the show. If you'd like to learn how you can help out the Clarinet podcast, please visit www.clarinet.com/support. Your help is very much appreciated and will help ensure that I can continue this show into the future for as long as possible. Of course, today's episode is also brought to you by our sponsor, D'Addario Woodwinds. Thanks so much for listening. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is refining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with the world's most innovative techniques, so you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds. So I'm here today with Clark W. Fobes, who is, of course, the world-famous mouthpiece and barrel manufacturer, but also an active player in the San Francisco Bay Area. How did you get started with your career, and how do you maintain such an active playing schedule while you do continue to manufacture your products?
Well, I moved here in 1981 to go to school at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And at that time, I was moving from Fresno, where I'd been an instrument repairman for 5 years. So I moved here with, a set of skills and to back me up in case the playing didn't work out. But I was very fortunate that first year at the conservatory that I was hired for 3 operas in the San Francisco opera season. And so I immediately sort of started this duo career of playing, and at that time I wasn't repairing instruments. I was just working on my master's degree. But through that entree, then I was eventually hired by the symphony as an extra player and the ballet as an extra player. And I've maintained those contacts for 35 years. And I still play pretty actively with all those groups. In fact, this week I'll be playing with the San Francisco Ballet.
And you don't just play soprano clarinet, you actually are an active doubler.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I moved here in San Francisco, with the opera, I did initially play a lot of clarinet, but people found out that I was a very good bass clarinet player pretty quickly. And I started doing a lot of bass clarinet playing. In fact, I was in the finals for the bass clarinet job with the Met Opera Orchestra in 1986. And then 2 months later, I was the runner-up for the bass clarinet position in the Cincinnati Symphony. I ended up never winning a job, but I think that those orchestras did me a favor because I really love living in San Francisco. And anyway, but yes, I do double. Recently, I played E-flat clarinet with the San Francisco Symphony. When there was recording work here, I was also playing the contrabass bass clarinet chair at Skywalker Ranch Studios.
What is it about San Francisco that you love so much?
You know, it's just, to me, it's still the most beautiful city in the world that I've visited. And it's just, I like living on the coast. I can see the ocean from my house. I do like the weather here. I don't mind the fog too much in the summer. It's a very cosmopolitan city. We have 3 great orchestras here, the symphony, the opera, and the ballet orchestra. And there's just so much going on culturally. We have great museums. There's just so much going on here culturally. There's great food. As you probably know, I'm a big foodie and a wine collector, and we're very close to the wine country. So this has really just been a fabulous place for me to live.
Yeah, as far as the wine and stuff, there's really no better place.
Well, maybe Burgundy, France, which I go to every summer too.
Yeah. In America anyways, maybe.
Yeah, that's it.
So that's amazing. You mentioned on your bio that you've played in some movie soundtracks. Is there any that would come to mind that people would recognize?
I think one of the most memorable was a very goofy movie called Mars Attacks. Do you remember that movie?
I have seen that. Yes, I have.
With Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
So I played the entire score on that. And what was memorable is that I played B-flat clarinet, E-flat clarinet, bass clarinet, E-flat contra alto, and B-flat contrabass.
At the same time? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, a lot of switching around, of course.
So was that like, are you saying that you layered some pieces, or was it just constant switching back and forth?
Constant switching back and forth.
Wow.
The way that when you record, when you do a recording session, they will record, small sets, and each particular section may have bass clarinet switching to contrabass clarinet or clarinet switching to bass clarinet. It's rare that within one take that you have to play more than 2 instruments.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. The film aspect really interests me. What is that like? Would you sort of walk me through what a session is like at the studio for a movie?
So the thing that's different about playing a recording session than playing in an orchestra is you do not get the music ahead of time. So it's really sight reading. Some sessions the music is fairly easy. If you're playing something like a John Williams score, the music can be quite hard. And essentially what you do is you may, depending on the conductor, you may have a read through where everybody just plays their part without recording it, but there's no rehearsing per se. It's just you need to be able to sit down and have the skills to sight read and make it sound good. And so, but on the other hand, there can be multiple takes of each section. So you do have several chances to get it right.
Like, is it as cutthroat as people say it is? I always hear these sort of horror stories about, a mistake and you're out kind of thing.
Yeah, I think because recording scene here in San Francisco is so small compared to Los Angeles that it's not the same type of scene. There is one contractor that was doing all the movie work up here, and she essentially tried to hire first the San Francisco Symphony, and if players in the San Francisco Symphony could not make it, then she would try to hire people from either the opera or the ballet. And then there would be a few people like me that are extras that would get called. So it's actually very, very friendly up here.
Do you, I suppose you would watch along with the screen then as the conductor conducts? Do you have to wear headphones?
No, you wear headphones for a click track. You do not. The screen is behind you. You don't want that distraction.
So the conductor sees the screen, but you don't.
Conductor, yeah, it's very. They have it down to a science, wow. And the conductor actually has the click track going in his head too, as well as there's a signal that goes across the movie screen that shows where the music should line up. So it's quite technical.
As you play then, I mean, click tracks I always find quite bothersome, especially when I'm playing clarinet. Can you hear what you're doing properly with the headphones on, or do you learn to accommodate for that? Do you have a monitor?
Well, what you do is you have a headphone that you essentially have a speaker on one side and the other side is open.
Oh, okay.
So, and you can decide whether you want to listen to the speaker in your right ear or your left ear. It's up to you. So you can hear, but you also get some of the orchestra in along with the click track. But then you have this open ear that you're actually listening to the ensemble around you. It is a little disconcerting when you first do it, but you get used to it.
Yeah, I mean, especially in an orchestra setting where you're used to, for the second clarinet player or whatever, listening left. I mean, and then you plug up your right ear. I mean, it seems very strange.
Well, so the way I do it is because I'm usually sitting on the end. I'm playing bass clarinet. Is that I have the headphone speaker in my right ear, and so then I can listen left, and that works pretty well.
So did you go to the movie when it came out then, or the movies when they come out?
Well, some of them. Some of them I'm not interested in. I remember we did Inspector Gadget. I wasn't really interested in seeing that. We did some touch-ups on Jurassic Park 3.
Oh, wow.
Of course, I did see that. And, I don't even remember. I think we did Ratatouille, or whatever that movie is about the rat that goes to Paris.
Yeah, I remember that.
I never saw that movie. I generally don't go to movies, so yes, no, I did not.
So you play on them sometimes, but you don't go as much.
Exactly.
Yeah, it must be so interesting though to sit there and you're watching the film and hearing yourself playing clarinet if you do go.
Yeah, so. Actually there is a one movie where you can usually, for example, in Mars Attacks, there's so much other noise and explosions going on that you can't really hear the orchestra that much. But I did a really creepy science fiction movie, and I cannot remember the name of it, but it has something to do with human beings that get infected with some kind of a virus, and they turn into vampire-like giant cockroaches.
Oh wow, that's very strange.
And it had two iterations. But I played on the first one, which had a big contrabass clarinet solo, and that was kind of fun.
Well, not many clarinet players have to deal with gigantic cockroaches and explosions competing with their music, luckily. So that's what an interesting thing to be doing, though. Wow. So how did you segue from, you developed an interest in mouthpieces when you began your career in the early 80s. But how does an interest in researching mouthpieces or wanting to learn about mouthpieces lead to producing over 10,000 over the next 30 years? I did a little bit of quick math, actually, and if you made a mouthpiece every single day for those 30 some odd years, that would be about the right number. So that's a lot of work.
Well, what happened, the genesis of getting involved in mouthpieces is that I had a business repairing instruments, which became primarily clarinets. So when I moved to San Francisco in 1981, after that first fall season with the opera, I was still in school, I still had to do something to make a living. So I started working for a firm called the Woodwind and Brasswind Workshop, and which we often were confused with the woodwind and the brasswind. But it was a highly specialized repair shop in San Francisco, by far the best repair shop in the Bay Area at that time. And I worked for a gentleman named Erwin Berger, who was a bassoonist and very fine bassoon repairman. I worked there for 3 years, but then I became so active in my freelancing that I just couldn't keep up the schedule they wanted. So I quit. And then I started my own business about 3 years later in 3 months later in 1985. And so just as part of repairing instruments, people would occasionally bring me mouthpieces and say, can you touch this up? Or, is this fixable? And my best friend at the time was Greg Dufford. He still is my best friend, but he was the bass clarinetist with the San Francisco Opera Orchestra. And Greg was very interested in mouthpiece making. In fact, he made me a bass clarinet mouthpiece that I played for about 15 years. And he showed me his techniques and what he did, and I just became very interested in it and started just experimenting and, refacing mouthpieces for people, and eventually thought, this is something I like to do. And I decided to start making mouthpieces as part of my repair business. I think the first year that I actually, said that I was a mouthpiece maker was probably around 1987 or 1988.
So once you start working on the mouthpiece, there are many parts of the mouthpiece which you can sort of affect with various adjustments. How do you decide which areas to work on, and what sort of happens when you change those areas?
Well, that is the craft of mouthpiece making. I think that there are plenty of guys that can learn how to put a nice facing on a mouthpiece, but really, I don't want to denigrate the art of mouthpiece refacing or what it takes to put a good facing on a mouthpiece. But really, from my work, that's only about 10%. What's really interesting about mouthpiece acoustics is what's going on inside the mouthpiece. And there's nothing written about it. I did a lot of research and I tried to, find anything that was written about it. And really, all that I know, I've discovered on my own. I have done some reading. There's a couple of very good acoustic books. One is called The Foundations of Musical Acoustics by Arthur Banane, who was a famous acoustician that taught at Case Western. And he has that was his textbook. And although I don't know calculus, and there is some calculus in the book, I was able to glean some information from it that was very important to my work. They had to do with baffle shapes and volumes and airflow. So essentially what I did is I just started messing around with mouthpieces and ruined a whole lot of them in the process of figuring out what does what. And as I got farther into it, I realized that probably the most important aspect of the mouthpiece is the bore. And I thought, well, how am I going to change the bore? I'm going to have bore reamers made. So I started this exploration with a company in San Francisco that they made my first reamer for about $500. And then I subsequently had them make about 4 or 5 more, and everyone got progressively more expensive until I finally got to the point where I had thought I had the ideal shape and taper, and I asked them to make it for me, and they go, well, that's going to be $1,500. And I said, what? This is back in, before even 1990. And they said, essentially, we don't want to make them anymore for you. So I still have the original 5 reamers, and I am able to sharpen them, but that is the most important part of my work, is being able to adjust the tuning and the voicing with the from the bore. So that part of it is something that has become very interesting as part of my proprietary information that I don't really share with anybody. I'll share the process, but I don't share exactly what I do.
So for someone who might not know, then we've got the facing, the bore. What other parts are there kind of that a layperson, or even not a layperson, maybe, your average clarinet player might not know about or might not understand?
Well, the 3 essential parts, of course, are the facing, the bore, and the chamber. Within the chamber, there's a lot of variation too. It has to do with, how close are the sidewalls to the center? How do you shape the baffle? And I mean, by the baffle, I mean the entire area from the bottom of the chamber where it enters the bore up to the tip. And then we have the area that's just essentially called the tip baffle, which is right behind the tip rail, which has a huge effect on the way a mouthpiece responds and sounds. And then all the variations of window shape, window size, chamber depth, and even then also the outside shape of the mouthpiece makes a difference. But essentially, it's the bore, the chamber, and the facing, those 3 things working together that gives a mouthpiece its particular sound.
So I won't ask you for specific measurements then, I guess, but so the way that someone might want to work on a mouthpiece to change it, does it start at the mouthpiece, or do you start with like a piece of paper and sort of make calculations? Or, I mean, you mentioned a lot of mouthpieces sort of got ruined trying to find the best one, so it makes me think that maybe it's sort of a trial and error aspect. How does it work?
Well, yeah, essentially it was trial and error. We do have, so there are limits to how far you can go with both the facing and the volume of the mouthpiece. There are minimum and maximum volumes that will work. Once you get beyond those, then the mouthpiece doesn't tune or it doesn't respond. But I never did anything as far as, mathematical calculations. Essentially, you take a mouthpiece that works, you find a mouthpiece that works, and you measure that, and you try and copy it. It's like, the great artists, they would all go to, let's think of the Impressionists, especially. One of the things that they would do is go to the Louvre and they would copy the great masters. And by doing that, learn a lot about the work. So the greatest master that, I've run into several, but the greatest master who I never met, of course, was Frank Casper. Not all of his mouthpieces were great, but the good ones were excellent. And I played Casper mouthpieces for most of my career before I started making my own mouthpiece. And I learned a lot by collecting Casper mouthpieces and measuring their facings in particular, and then also by measuring their bores. And so I would just attempt to replicate a facing. I did do a little bit of work with Everett Mattson. We essentially just spent an entire afternoon together, and he, I would have to say, was the finest refacer of mouthpieces I've ever met. He just had a great hand and a great touch, and very gentle man in the truest sense of the word, and very generous. He would not charge me for his time, and he just felt he was passing the torch on to me. So we had a very special relationship, and anybody that knew him knows that he was just a master craftsman at refacing mouthpieces. And then another gentleman I worked with was a man named Glenn Johnston, who was in LA for many years. He played the studios and kind of a cantankerous old man, but had a lot of knowledge and was more, fly by the seat of his pants. He was interesting. He would not really use gauges so much to test his work. He knew when he was putting a facing on what it was doing and how it would react. And he made some very good mouthpieces for me. I played one of his bass clarinet mouthpieces for about 5 years. But essentially, it's trial and error. Because unless you have somebody teaching you, which other than those two men, I didn't really have anybody teaching me.
So you've made over 10,000 professional mouthpieces in the 30 years that you've been doing it.
Yeah, actually, I'm up to 11,045 as of last night.
And that does not include the debut of the Nova? That's only the professional series?
So the debut mouthpieces, if you include the clarinet, saxophone, bass clarinet, all those, last year I think we sold around 14,000.
Oh my God.
So we do, in the last 10 years, at least 10,000 a year of those. And I don't make those anymore. Jeff Anderley, my assistant, makes those. And he's become really, really good at it. And I don't even have to test them anymore. He's so good. So fortunately, I don't have to do this. Also, Jeff also makes the Nova mouthpieces. The Nova mouthpieces, the clarinet and the bass clarinet, are my own core design, which I worked with J.J. Babbitt. So those are my own molds. Nobody else can buy them. And particularly the bass clarinet mouthpiece, we just redesigned, and it's just fantastic, especially for the price. We tried to, I essentially tried to make it very similar to my 10K bass clarinet mouthpiece, and I think I succeeded.
So this is a handmade mouthpiece then for just $159, basically?
Well,
they start at the Novas?
The Nova clarinet mouthpiece and bass clarinet mouthpiece are molded at J.J. Babbitt. And so they come to me as a, quote, finished mouthpiece. But part of the problem with molding mouthpieces is that the bore is cooled on what's called a shrink plug. And can be a wide variation of how that shrinks. Sometimes they pull off a little bit and the bore becomes quite small. So even with the Nova mouthpieces, they're all hand reamed. And then we have to go through and make adjustments to the window and the facing. Bass clarinet as well.
So I should mention that I just misspoke there. The Nova B-flat clarinet mouthpiece is actually starting at $159, and the bass clarinet one starts at $179. But that's still a great deal for something that's been, really hand finished and had some attention.
And that is my list price. If you go to Woodwind & Brasswind, who is my largest distributor, they have a substantial discount on that. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're really looking at handmade mouthpieces that are down around the price of a Van Doren mouthpiece, which I have to say, I really do not like Van Doren mouthpieces, and I've never played them in my entire career. I have never played a Van Doren mouthpiece, never owned one. I know a lot of people play them. I think for the price, if you can try enough of them, they're like Van Doren reeds. You might find 1 out of 10 that plays okay. And there are a lot of people that play them, and there is a need for that. But one of the problems with Van Doren pricing is that it's made it very difficult for people like me to make a good living on a handmade mouthpiece. So with the Nova mouthpieces, that is something that we just don't have a very large profit margin on, but because we have to keep it at a price that can be competitive with Van Doren. But I feel very dedicated to the idea of being able to produce a good handmade mouthpiece that students and amateurs can afford.
So what is the difference then for people who are looking at these kind of products? And I understand it's obviously a lot of more time gets invested the higher we go up in price, but what other differences are there between like the debut Nova and then as we get up into your San Francisco and Europa and then eventually the 10K and CWF?
Yeah. Well, so let's start at the debut mouthpiece. So one of the reasons that we can keep the price low on that, and I have not changed the price on those in, I think, 7 years now. So the list price on the debut Clarinet mouthpiece is $39.50, and I'm really dedicated to try to keep that price below $40. And the reason we can keep the price low on that is it's an injection molded mouthpiece that's made at J.J. Babbitt. And so injection molding is plastic or acrylic, and it's a very accurate and inexpensive way to make mouthpieces. I think, for many years, plastic mouthpieces were denigrated because, essentially that's what student instruments came with, and they were terrible. Mm-hmm. The old, anything that you would get with a student grade mouthpiece was, with a student grade horn, was essentially just terrible. It was David Height that first came up with the idea of hand finishing a plastic mouthpiece, and that was his premier mouthpiece, which Babbitt now owns that mouthpiece and they sell. And I met David at one time. He was also very generous and kind. And we talked a lot about mouthpieces. And this is before I started making I was just making mouthpieces for myself. I met him in Florida in 1986 when I was on tour. And we were talking about mouthpieces. And he says, "Forget the pros. They don't know what they want. All the money's in the student mouthpieces." and I thought, that's true. And so after a while, I contacted Babbitt and I said, well, let me, they were already making a mouthpiece for me, and they had a facing cam, which is a way of just facing a mouthpiece by machine. And I said, why don't you run some samples for me on this plastic mouthpiece? And it turned out it was great. It was fantastic. And so we have them mold the basic mouthpiece. They put my facing on it, my CF Plus facing. And then when we get it, we do some touch up on the mouthpiece. We do a final finish, which evens out the facing. We do a little bit of work on the tip rail and the side rails, and then do a little bit of polishing with steel wool on the inside. And they just play fantastic. So we can keep the price down on that because they're essentially so good off the machinery. Then the next level up, the Nova mouthpieces require quite a bit more work because they are a molded mouthpiece. For a long time, Babbitt was making my professional mouthpiece before I started using Zinner blanks. The reason I stopped using Babbitt for my professional mouthpiece is that they ran into a period where they were having a lot of trouble with rubber, and it was just everything that they were sending me was just not very good. And then I met the Zinners at the Clarinet conference in, I think, 1991 in New Orleans, and we talked about mouthpieces and pricing and what they could do for me. And so I established this relationship with them, and they've been excellent. And I've been using their mouthpieces now for a very long time, since 1991. But getting back to the Nova mouthpieces, those are a lot of work. But the thing that's nice about those is that I've been able to work with Babbitt on developing a core mold, which is the inside shape, the negative space. And that is something that's very close to my ideal shape that I like. And then we have to do just a little bit of tweaking, but it's such a good shape that I've come up with that essentially all we have to do on the clarinet mouthpieces is change the bore and do a little bit of work on the facing, and they play really, really well. I'm very proud of that mouthpiece. I think it's a fantastic mouthpiece at the price. And then the bass clarinet mouthpiece we just redesigned a year ago. I had been using a generic mold that they had, which was pretty good, but it never really played the way that I wanted a good bass clarinet mouthpiece to play. So I invested the money in a new mold, and we worked on it it took over 6 months to get it developed between samples, and they would send me the core, I would work on it, send it back. And anyway, I think of the Nova mouthpieces as professional quality mouthpieces that are priced so that students and amateurs can buy them without breaking the bank. Then the Zinner mouthpieces, the San Francisco series, those mouthpieces are produced for me by Hans Zinner in Germany, and I think they have some of the best rubber. And I like the mouthpiece very much, and I sell a ton of them. Again, because it's a molded mouthpiece, there are problems with the bore. I know that there are mouthpiece makers that use Zinner. Well, just about every mouthpiece maker in the United States now uses Zinner as a place to start. Very few, if any, actually take the trouble to rebore them. Zinner can offer either a small bore or a large bore mouthpiece. The large bore is closer to the bore that I like to use, but because of the vagaries of molding, sometimes they would be too large and they would play flat and they wouldn't respond well. So after some experimenting, I have always bought their small bore mouthpiece, and I ream them up to my specifications. That way I have a lot more control of the intonation, and also I can standardize the bore. Whereas if you just buy a Zinner mouthpiece and you don't adjust the bore, it's crazy how different each mouthpiece can be. So there is quite a bit of work involved with the Zinner mouthpieces. They come to me essentially as a blank that really doesn't play very well, and just without any work on it. So there's quite a bit of handwork involved in those. I have Jeff do all the reaming because I'm developing tendonitis in my elbow, but he does all the reaming for me and preps the blanks, and then I do the final finish work. And the bass clarinet mouthpieces, the bore is pretty good on those, and because it's a larger mouthpiece, the small changes from mouthpiece to mouthpiece don't have as much of effect on the intonation and the sound as it does on a soprano clarinet mouthpiece. But given that, it is a molded mouthpiece, and Zinner can only produce one bore shape, and they do have several different baffle shapes. They have different models of mouthpieces, but I've settled on two, their A blank and their E blank, and their E blank is slightly modified for me in the way that they cut it. But their A blank which is what I use for the CWF mouthpiece. But because it's a molded mouthpiece and it's their design, I'm stuck with what they produce. I can only modify it so much. In my personal playing, I played an older Babbitt mouthpiece for about 18 years that I just loved. And I could never get a Zinner mouthpiece to respond that way, even though I made a lot of great Zinner mouthpieces, and I have a couple as backups to my other mouthpiece. I could never really get the sound to go the way that I wanted to get the spin and the sound. And that's when I came up with the idea of working with Wes Rice on making this 10K mouthpiece. Actually, it was an idea I've had for a while. I went to another manufacturer earlier and was just very unhappy with the results that I got from their machining. And so I abandoned that project. And then I had met Wes through my business. He was selling some of my student mouthpieces. And then he contacted me one day and he said, Clark, I just bought this very expensive CNC lathe. CNC means computer numerically controlled lathe. So basically a lathe that's he can run through a computer program. And he says, I have this program, and he says, I need to pay, or I have this new lathe, I need to pay for it. Do you have any projects? I said, well, sure. Let me see how you do on making some barrels for me. So he made some barrels for me, and they were very good. And then I said, well, I've had this idea for a long time of making a Delrin barrel. Could you make those for me? And he says, sure. So he ran several of those for me. This is my HDP barrel, which is this high-density polypropylene, essentially Delrin, which have turned out to be fantastic barrels, and they're very inexpensive. They're only $100. So progressing through this, he started doing some, when we ran out of time and we couldn't do all the barrels here, he would make some barrels for me. And then he called me and says, Clark, I want to start making mouthpieces for you. And I said, really? You don't know how to make mouthpieces? And he says, well, I can figure it out. Now, Wes, who you spoke to, I guess, about a month ago?
Yeah, it was just before I went to Midwest.
Yeah. Have you met him?
Yeah. Actually, no, I haven't. Yeah. Not in person.
Okay. So Wes is a very brilliant guy, and I in the process of working on this, I actually went to his shop in Maryland. It's been well over a year now. We were in the process of working on this mouthpiece, and he's sort of the MacGyver of the clarinet world. This guy can figure out anything. He's just got this ability to figure things out. And I was a little skeptical, but he bought a CNC milling machine, an inexpensive one, and he just started going at it. And he taught himself how to write CAD programming, taught himself how to use this tool, and so we started working on making mouthpieces and together. And he learned a lot from me, and I learned a lot about the process of making mouthpieces. It's taken us a lot longer than either of us expected. In the process, he realized that the first machine he bought was not going to be capable of producing the type of mouthpiece, the type of finish that I required. So he invested in a much more expensive CNC milling machine, and the results we've been getting recently have been much, much better. We finally, just in the last week, I think we've arrived at the absolute final version of the clarinet mouthpiece. We arrived at the final version of the bass clarinet mouthpiece a couple months ago, but we have been working on the clarinet mouthpiece for 2 years.
Mm-hmm. The 10K, you mean?
The 10K, yeah, excuse me, the 10K mouthpiece. So the 10K mouthpiece came out of this frustration that I had with the Zinner blanks and not being able to produce the same sound I was getting from this old Babbitt blank that I played on for so many years. And so now I'm playing a 10K mouthpiece, and I'm really ecstatic. I feel like I'm really playing with the best sound that I've ever played with. And it just, the intonation is great, and I've used it a lot now. The one that I'm playing, I think I've been playing well over 6 months. So I've played it in the symphony, I've played it in the opera, I've played principal in the opera with it, I've played it in the ballet, and it's taking a while to catch on. Part of it is that Woodwind and Brasswind, who is my largest distributor, doesn't really want to pick it up yet. I think they think it's too expensive. So essentially, I'm the only distributor of the mouthpiece. So it's going to take a while to get into the stream. But I think as people find out about it and they try them for me, they really like them.
So you've really outdone yourself then. I mean, Clark W. Fobes himself has moved to the 10K from the CWF mouthpiece.
Yeah. Well, it's always a progress of finding the best thing for myself, because I would never sell anything that I wouldn't play on myself. That's always been part of what I've done. There are guys out there that make mouthpieces that are wildly different from what I make. And I just won't try to I won't try to imitate them, because I don't like that sound, or I don't like that type of response. And I've just always felt, and this has been part of my business career, is that I will not sell anything that I don't believe in. I just won't. And because you can tell when you're talking to, if you've spoken to any salesman, you can tell whether they believe in their product or not. And so I just believe in playing what I sell and what I make. And this may sound odd to you, but as a mouthpiece maker, I'm very monogamous. I have, like I said, I played that one mouthpiece for 18 years, even though I've been, in that time probably produced 9,000 mouthpieces. I was never swayed to play something other than this one mouthpiece. I get real stuck on equipment like that. I don't switch around a lot. And then as far as bass clarinet mouthpiece, I have a 10K that I'm using now, and I have a Zinner blank that I played for a long time. So, I definitely play my own equipment, of course, my own barrels too.
I have to ask, with the 10K, there's this unique blue sort of, almost like I know this is kind of a silly way to describe it, but for listeners, almost like the bowling ball look. Sort of the blue. How did that come about? How does that work?
Well, the manufacturer that we buy the rubber from is in Germany. Schoenberger Ebonite Manufacturer is the name, SEM. And anybody can go to their website, and you can see that they produce these multicolored rods of rubber. So this is also an essentially important part of the 10K mouthpiece. It's not molded; it's machined from a solid piece of rubber, and I'm convinced that there is something molecularly different about working with a solid piece of rubber as opposed to a molded piece of rubber. Now, I have to say that I've always felt that the sound of the mouthpiece is more directly correlated to the shape and the volume and the acoustical space than the material. That said, if you get the tip of the mouthpiece thin enough, then you start getting some influence from the composition of the material. But until you get to the point where the tip is thin enough that it actually starts vibrating with the reed, I don't think that the material makes that much difference. A lot of people will argue that with me. But I really believe that most of the sound comes from the shape of the mouthpiece. But getting back to the hard rubber that's made by SEM, it's excellent rubber. And they offer these different types of rubber in different colors. And I was just fascinated with the idea of making something that just looked a little bit different. So I bought some of this blue rubber, which I thought was the most beautiful of all the ones that they offer. And, I've seen this before. Saxophone mouthpiece makers like Rafael Navarro use these multicolored mouthpieces, and they buy the rubber from SEM as well. What was interesting was that I found that the blue rubber does actually have a different sound. If you use exactly the same dimensions, it has a slightly brighter sound. And I wrote to SEM and I mentioned this. I said, this is my observation, and it finishes out a little differently. And they said that because of the dye that they use to mix with the rubber to give that color, they have to add a little bit more carbon for the whole thing to hold together. So I suppose the mouthpiece material is a little bit harder, but people seem to like it and respond to it. It's not just the color, it's also the sound. And particularly on bass clarinet, it really picks up the sound a lot.
That's fascinating. Are you playing the blue version?
I have a blue version, but I'm playing just the black version myself.
I have to say, there's a problem, is because I tried these at Clarinet Fest, and I've been thinking about them ever since. And I'm a little bit nostalgic for them for some reason, because back in the day, I know you say you're not a huge fan of Van Doren stuff, but I did have in the early 90s, maybe the late 90s, they did like
a red rubber.
A red rubber. And I had one of those, and all through junior high school, it was my first like real mouthpiece. It was one of those things. I was such a clarinet dork. I always tell this to students who don't take me seriously when I recommend they ask their parents for a mouthpiece for Christmas. But I remember I had asked my parents for a mouthpiece, and it was in my stocking, and I was so keen that when I got to the mouthpiece in my stocking, I put down the rest of my Christmas stocking and went and practiced. And
That's a great story.
I had that mouthpiece for so long, and when I eventually wanted to upgrade in university, like as I was auditioning, I wanted to upgrade, and I actually sold that mouthpiece. I've always regretted it because they've also become rather rare. So I see these now, and I'm like, oh my God, that's that cool little look again. It's
yeah. Well, there are, you have to be of a certain age to know about those Van Doren mouthpieces. But yeah, I remember those, and also Charlie Bay was making those multicolored mouthpieces for quite a while. I don't know if you remember that.
No, I've not seen those ones. Actually, maybe I have, because they sometimes circulate online. You see pictures of crazy stuff.
He didn't make them for very long, but he was using red rubber. Now Charlie, he's an interesting figure, and he's one of these guys that he's not as popular now, and part of it is that he's just not active. But when I was growing up and I was in high school, he was kind of the guy because he was in Southern California, which is where I grew up. And I wish I had the opportunity to talk to him more about his process, but I know that I think that the majority of his clarinet mouthpieces were manufactured at a company called New York Hamburg, which is the same place that Van Doren has their mouthpieces molded. I don't think that I think Van Doren has separate facilities for finishing their mouthpieces, but New York Hamburg is like the place where a lot of mouthpiece manufacturers have their mouthpieces molded. And I think that they had this proprietary rubber that was multicolored, and so that's why Van Doren used it, and Charlie Bay. But it's interesting that Van Doren abandoned that, and they don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I've often wondered, this is going into a totally different conversation, of course, but a lot of these manufacturers of these sort of Chinese instruments that are making, pink clarinets or blue clarinets or whatever, they're quite popular with children. And, although I don't think those are, real instruments to work with, I can understand why the kids are drawn to them. And it often confuses me. Maybe it's just an economy of scale, but why larger manufacturers haven't decided to do that. So.
Well, I think, it's interesting. When I first came out with the blue mouthpiece, and there was one guy named Ken Yarsik, I think is his name, whom I've never met, but in person, but he's a big fan of mine, and he's bought, I think, every mouthpiece that I make. But when he got the blue 10K, he posted a beautiful photo on Facebook, and the pushback that I got from that was like, people were either like, astounded at how beautiful it looked, or they'd say like, I would never play a blue mouthpiece. And I think that among clarinet players, there's just a certain amount of conservatism that, people are not going to play. Most people are not going to play something different than a black clarinet and a black mouthpiece. Although, with the advent of Bakun, there are a lot of people that are playing the Cocobolo clarinets, which I think is not a great material to make clarinets out of, to tell you the truth. But there is a nice visual appeal to it.
Well, and yeah, the whole clarinet world is a little bit weird in that way. I mean, why would someone else feel negatively affected because you choose to make or play on a different colored mouthpiece? I mean, what could be more superficial in a way?
Yeah.
It's kind of odd, but I'm in line with you. I think that what's really cool about the blue version is it takes the sort of uniqueness of each one a step further. Like, they're all beautiful in their own way. They're kind of blended. They look really, really neat. And, from a distance, it's kind of like a marbled look. I think it's pretty classy, actually. I don't know. Yeah. No, I like it. And because of the nature of the material, every mouthpiece is unique. They don't all look the same. And
I took in a blue mouthpiece to an opera rehearsal, I think this summer, and it really, caught a lot of people's attention.
So that's a lot of great information about your mouthpieces. I'm so glad we had the chance to have that conversation. But I also, of course, am really interested in your barrels, and your barrels are kind of what got me started on your brand over 10 years ago now. And I actually have a rather funny story about that. Maybe I'll share in a minute. But what got you segued from the mouthpieces into the barrels? And would you tell me a little bit about your line of barrels and the different materials and sort of the specs kind of along the same line as the mouthpieces?
Sure. So what got me into experimenting with barrels was that I think that, I was already making mouthpieces, but one of the things that just always bothered me about buffet clarinets, which I've played all my career, was that I could never find an A barrel that I liked, and I was never happy with my A clarinet, and I knew that it had to do with the barrel. So I just started. I was a buffet dealer at the time, and so I knew that David Height, from his experiments and from talking to him, he made barrels, but what he was doing was buying buffet barrels and reaming them out. And so I started experimenting with the same way. And as you know, or may know, the buffet A barrels are a much smaller bore than the B flat barrels. Mm-hmm. So I would buy the A barrels and I would ream them out. And this was and I had a reamer made. I made a good guess on what I thought the taper should be. And I bought my first set of reamers. I had a friend who was an oboe player, but also a very fine machinist. And he made me two reamers, two different tapers, and a very special bore gauge, which I still use. And that was the beginning of my experimentation with barrels. And again, whole process of like messing up a lot of barrels, which was quite expensive, because even as a dealer, I think the buffet barrels at that time were costing me close to $100. So, you ruin one, you're out a lot of money.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I did that for several years, and I got some good results. But then it just got too expensive to buy the barrels, and I just thought, well, why am I not making these myself? And I didn't own a lathe at the time, but I have a good friend who was doing my engraving on my mouthpieces. He was connected to a couple of machinists down in the South Bay. And he says, I have this friend who has a very nice shop, and he might be willing to take on a small project like that. And so I went down and met with him, and I was just immediately impressed with him. Because his shop was so clean. I mean, he had all this machinery and you could eat off the floor. It was just amazing. And he had never worked in wood before, and he was kind of fascinated by the idea. So I don't know if you've seen any of these barrels. We made them probably for about 5 years. This fellow's name was Oscar, and I cannot remember his last name. He would make the rings for me, and he would make the barrel bodies, and then I would ream them out. And we had a really nice, joint venture there for several years. And then he kept raising his prices, and then it was just starting to get, too expensive. And I thought, well, why don't I just buy a lathe and start, messing with this myself? So I bought an Enco lathe, a 9x20 lathe, which I'd never operated a lathe before, but I figured, how hard could it be? And so I eventually started making my own barrels, and that was quite an informative experience. And I couldn't ever really figure out how to make metal rings, so I had this idea that I would make Delrin rings, and that was somewhat successful because the wood would change, the rings would release. And then finally, after struggling with that for about a year or two, I just thought, why am I even using rings? let's try making barrels without rings, because I had seen them. Louis Rossi, do you know his clarinets?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So he and I had become very good friends. I'd met him at the Clarinet Conference in Ghent in 1993. And he's a wonderful manufacturer, wonderful person, fantastic clarinetist. I don't know if you've ever heard him, but just amazing.
Yeah, his clarinets are amazing too.
A lot of people play his clarinets. Really, wonderfully handmade clarinets. The mechanism is beautiful.
One of the only ones to be made out of a solid tube, if I recall correctly.
That's correct. Yeah, that's part of his idea. And it's a very good idea too. Anyway, I talked to him and I noticed that he didn't use any rings on his clarinets, on any of the joints. And I said, "Don't you have trouble with them cracking?" And he said, "Well, we make sure that the wood is very stable before we machine it." And he says, "I have very little problems with them cracking." I did some experimenting and I found that if I made the tenons thick enough, that there probably would be, because that's where the tension comes from, fitting them either with the mouthpiece or on the body. And so if they're going to crack, they're going to crack because the tenons are not thick enough or they're not properly sized. And I experimented with a lot of different shapes. And the shape that I have basically came up from what is the least amount of wood I can use and still make the barrel strong enough. And as I experimented with it, I found that if you put the weight, the bulk of the weight in a different part of the barrel, it changes the way it sounds. So you look at, like, for example, a Bakun Fat Boy barrel. Most of the weight is near the middle of the barrel, and that produces a particular type of sound. Generally, the more mass that you have in the barrel, the brighter the sound is. And you would think it would be the opposite way around, but what happens is that when you have either a very dense material or a very large amount of material at the barrel, it restricts the barrel from vibrating on its own. When the barrel vibrates itself, then it starts influencing the air column. And so when you start getting this confluence of the vibrating air column and the vibrating body of the clarinet, or the vibrating body of the barrel, it disturbs the sound in such a way that it creates more resistance, and we perceive that as darkness and or resistance. So if you go to a heavier barrel, you'll actually get a little bit brighter sound. It seems counterintuitive, but this is what my experimenting showed. So my barrels are designed to play with my mouthpieces, and I want something that is both responsive and warm sounding. So that's how I came up with my shape. And I also really think that having no rings allows the barrel to vibrate more. There's more constraint. And if you experiment with if you could, you can't, but if I was to put rings on my barrels, you would see that there would be a different sound. They would probably be, with the rings, maybe a little bit more focused, but not as generous as far as, feeling that the sound is flexible. Now, you can also change the quality of sound, of course, by the shape of the bore and the size of the bore. But generally speaking, the mass of the barrel does have a great influence on how it sounds. How did we get there? We were going from me starting to manufacture my own barrels. So that was over a long period of time that I developed them. And unfortunately, I wish I had kept a sample of every barrel that I made, of the different barrels, and I have not.
I was just going to ask if you still had one of those ringed ones and stuff like that.
I do have one of the ringed ones. I don't think I have any of the ones where I use the Delrin rings, and they were a different shape too. So I do have a couple of the old ringed ones, and those were a more traditional shape. They were shaped more or less like a buffet barrel with a little bit of a bulb about 2/3 down the body. They were excellent barrels, but I basically landed on the design that I have now maybe 10 years ago, I think, because I have to gauge this by how long Jeff has been working for me, because he makes most of the barrels. And he's in his 9th year of working for me, but we had already established that shape before he started working for me. So we really haven't changed it. But what has changed, as you know, because you had a bad experience with him, I did start making Cocobolo barrels. I've come to the conclusion that Cocobolo is not a good material to make barrels or clarinets from. Mm-hmm. It's just too porous, and it's too changeable. If I can find a really nice piece of Cocobolo, I think that they are stable. But the problem is finding a good source for Cocobolo, and I basically stopped making the solid Cocobolo barrels when Theodor Nagel of Germany they went out of business, and they had a source. I was buying fantastic Cocobolo, which was a very ruby red color. After they went out of business, I tried a couple of other sources, and a lot of the Cocobolo that I was getting was more orange or yellow in color, and that just doesn't make good barrels. It just is too changeable. So the barrel that you had that cracked was a Cocobolo barrel. Is that correct?
I actually had one of the new rubber line ones. I think the problem here, perhaps, is just like you're saying, maybe the climate's not good or something because it's very dry, and Cocobolo maybe just isn't the best wood to use. But I wanted the rubber lined one, which I also wanted you to talk about a bit, just because of the stability that brings to the tuning. And
yeah. So I went through this period of making Cocobolo barrels, and they have a beautiful sound, I have to say. And I played one for a while, but I found that they would change even as I played them. And so I stopped selling those, and then I came up with this idea, which was not an original idea, of putting a hard rubber insert into the Cocobolo barrels. So the hard rubber, of course, will not change at all. Now, unfortunately, in your case, the Cocobolo is still cracked around the hard rubber lining. But I think that's unusual. I've had very few of those hard rubber lined Cocobolo barrels crack. The reason I could make a hard rubber lined Grenadilla or Blackwood barrel, but I found it was too dense and too focused of a sound. I didn't like it. But in combination with the Cocobolo, it's a really nice sound, and it's very responsive, and it won't change. So we still do make those. Of course, they're $249, so we don't sell as many of those as the standard barrels.
Well, yeah, I have the standard ones. I've had them actually for many years. I also have the rubber line ones, though. I do find them to be a little bit like characteristically different, but both are really good.
Yeah.
I really, really have liked them in a lot of ways, and I always did wonder about the shape, so it's really interesting to hear about that today as we sort of talk about that. I have a funny story about those barrels, actually, if you're interested. Sure. I remember when I was in university, I was kind of, for a while, I sort of turned into a bit of a gearhead, I think kind of to my teacher's dismay. And so one day I had brought in this selection of barrels to try from various manufacturers, and yours was one of them. And I asked him to go out in the hallway and listen to me just play them and tell me which one was the best. And he insisted that I toss his barrel into the mix. And he's like, you just won't find one as good as this, but go ahead, right? So I was playing and he was listening and asked me to do it several times. And he asked me to do it several times more than I thought was maybe typical. Like he clearly was actually quite interested in what he was hearing. And finally he just said like, okay, that's mine. And it actually turned out to be yours. And he was so amazed that I had found a barrel that was better than his. I think he ordered about 6 of them. And so he's been using them ever since as well.
Oh, great.
But it was so funny because he had this sort of barrel that he really coveted for so many years and was really, really stunned by the sound and the quality and the response. And it was kind of interesting actually to see. But
my recollection is that the last ones that I sent you, which were Cocobolo, were really beautiful. They were they're probably darkened now, but they were like almost a bright red. Cocobolo comes essentially from Mexico, and so it's shipped all the way over to Germany, where they resaw it, and then it has to come all the way back to the United States, and it's just kind of ridiculous. But this particular distributor that I found in Germany has a fantastic source for Cocobolo, and I actually, even though I've said that I don't think Cocobolo is the best material for making barrels, this wood that I've bought from him, he said that has this is somebody that I knew through Theodore Nagel. Now he's working for this other company, and he says that particular batch of Cocobolo had been there drawing for at least 8 years, maybe longer. So I'm not going to give you the name because I don't want my competitors to go after them. But I just ordered a lot more because we've been, now that this is, I like the wood to sit for at least a year before we work on it. This particular batch of Cocobolo is so good and it's aged so well that I might start making a few solid Cocobolo barrels and see how it goes with this wood, because I have had a lot of people contact me that, would like to try those. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the process of the wood and how this works. So we buy the wood in what are called billets, and they're essentially about it depends on who I buy it from, but they're essentially 1 foot to 16 inches long and 1.5 inches square. So we buy these from the distributor, and we put them in downstairs in the garage, which is where my shop is, and let them sit for about a year or longer if we can, just to stabilize. Unfortunately, because the ambient humidity in San Francisco is so high, we don't really get down to the low water content that some manufacturers do. But there again, a lot of instrument manufacturers, I know that they do some kiln drying of their wood, and then to make it stable, they have to re-inject oils through pressure. So I'm just a fan of just letting the wood dry naturally. Mm-hmm. So it goes through this stabilizing period of at least a year, and then we turn it down into cylinders, cut those up to rough sizes of about 68 millimeters or 69 millimeters so that we can cut them down to any size. And then we through bore them, which they don't really start drying out until they're through bored and the air can really circulate. So we through bore them with a bore that's 1/2 inch, which is undersized for a clarinet bore. And then we put rough tenon bores in, because I found when I was making barrels myself, and we didn't do this, it's incredible how fast the tenon dimensions will change. And if you let a barrel that you manufacture, let's say you don't put this rough tenon in, you just manufacture the tenon to specifications, within a day it will have changed. And what happens is they don't really shrink, but they become egg-shaped. They shrink to the grain. And so then there's this whole process of trying to, open them up so that they fit properly, but they're not concentric anymore. So I found that if we put the rough tenons in and then we let them sit another 6 months to a year, then I would say 90% of the shrinking happens during that period. And then when we put the final bore and the final tenon shape in, or tenon dimensions in, they change very little, and especially with the black wood. So the process is, after they've been sitting in these rough blanks for 6 months to a year, then we put them on the lathe, and we do all the standard boring to the outside shape. We make the tenons to our specifications, and then we put in a rough bore that has approximately the correct angle, but it's undersized. And then we use a hand reamer for reaming them up to shape, and this further increases the stability, because then once it's finished out, it's then again sits in the drawer until I send them out. And at the very final process, I check them and I put in just a very final bore, which is only changing the dimension by about 0.02 of an inch. So I'm pretty confident by the time that we send the barrel out, it's very stable. I do have a guarantee on my barrels for a year that if they change or they crack, I'll replace them for free. Fortunately, I don't sell that many barrels, maybe 350 to 400 a year, but out of that amount, the percent that I get back that are cracked is maybe 1%, 4 or 5 a year.
How is the process different for the rubber lined one then? Is that like a core that's inserted afterwards, or it obviously doesn't grow in the tree?
No. Oh, so that's interesting. So what we do is we do the same steps with the rough blank, where we put in a rough bore and the rough tenons, and again we let that sit for probably 6 months to a year. Then this is why they're so much more expensive. Jeff does all the work on this, but we buy the rubber from Schoenberg SEM, and we buy these basically the core, which is about I think it's a little under 3/4 of an inch, and then we machine a little tapered piece, and then we machine the exact same taper inside the barrel. So this is oversized. Mm-hmm. And we also have, when we make this little tapered piece, we also put a rough bore in it. We start off by putting a rough bore through it, which is a 1/2 inch, and we taper the outside. So when we glue it, and then we glue it in with Gorilla Glue, which we found out has been a really, really good glue. So when we press it in, there's a little bit of taper, so we can really clamp it in and glue it under pressure. Those things are not coming out. And so once that part is glued in, then we go through all the next steps of finishing it out. So basically, what we end up with after the hard rubber insert is in there is a barrel blank that looks like our other barrel blanks, only it has a piece of rubber in it.
And then so your HDP synthetic barrel, that's sort of not really marketed to students. I guess it's sort of meant more to be incredibly stable and a different material for different palettes almost, I guess. How does that one work?
Well, so that actually I was hoping it would be a little bit less expensive than that, but it's just the material's expensive and they're machined. So there's just a certain amount of expense in all that. But I wanted to keep them under $100, sort of aiming for the student market, in that these work really well, in particular on the Buffet E11 clarinets. Mm. And you can make, you can really change the sound of a clarinet by changing the barrel. One of the barrels that's been very popular is my C barrels for the E11 C Clarinets. C Clarinets now have become so expensive. I think Buffet is only making a prestige C Clarinet, in a professional model. But in their student model, they make this E11 C Clarinet that's pretty darn good, but it doesn't have a good barrel. The barrel is just, I don't know what they were thinking, but it doesn't tune properly and it doesn't sound very good. So by putting one of my C barrels onto this still expensive clarinet, but relatively inexpensive to a prestige, it really transforms the instrument. So this is my idea for students. They could take, let's say somebody is playing even a plastic clarinet, but say an E11, their parents aren't ready to, fork out the money for an R13 or for, a Selmer Présence, or any other instrument. They can put a barrel on an instrument and really transform it. So, that was the idea behind the HDB barrel. It's also ideal for climates like the Southwest, like Arizona. If people call me from Arizona and want me to send them a barrel, I won't even do it. Because I said, because the experience I've had is they crack. And I think part of it is, our ambient humidity here is relatively high. I would say almost always 60% in my house, in my shop.
60%?
Yeah, probably 60%. Well, I live right next to the ocean. And so, we just, the ambient moisture in San Francisco itself is really very high. It's always between 60 and 100. We get 100 when it's foggy, and as we get a lot of fog in the summer. So very rarely when it's very cold, if we get a stretch of cold, it might get down to 30%, but that's really unusual.
So just to contrast, my house with the humidifier going full tilt for the piano, the guitars, and my clarinets and stuff, we can barely keep it at 30% in the winter.
Yeah.
It's a totally different climate here.
Well, that's and that is a problem with the Northeast too. Is that buildings are overheated in the winter when it's so cold, and that dries out the air in the house. But
it makes you sick too.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
But, so I think that there is a problem with my barrels. Once they go to a super dry climate like that, they just continue to dry, and it's that rapid drying that makes them crack. So
what are your humidifying recommendations then for your products and clarinets in general then? I mean, obviously there you don't really have to worry about it, but for clients that are in drier climates, would you recommend like a Lomax case or just little humidipacks or?
I think Mike's case is fantastic. That's a great idea. There's even a couple guys here in San Francisco that have those, and
really,
I mean, they're relatively inexpensive for what they are. And he even has a model that has an internal heater too, which is a great idea for places like Alberta, Canada, where you're walking outside and it's so darn cold. What makes clarinets crack is a rapid change in either humidity or temperature. And I think sometimes people, even professionals, are a little bit careless about, how they warm up their clarinet. You pull it out of your case. I mean, there's times where I don't turn on the heat at night in my house. It's a waste of energy. So it can get quite cold, and then I'll get up in the morning to practice, and I'll open the case, and it's just, the instrument is very, very cold. So what I like to do is either rest the instruments in my lap or turn on the heat and let the thing warm up a little bit before I play it. But what makes a clarinet crack is when the body is cold and then you immediately start playing it. What happens is that the inside of the clarinet expands much more rapidly than the outside, and that stress creates cracks.
What's the coldest though San Francisco could get there? I mean, we're talking.
Well, we had a stretch here last week where it was getting down to the high 30s at night, which is
it's freezing, right? You're talking Fahrenheit, obviously.
Yeah, Fahrenheit. Yeah, well, freezing is 32 Fahrenheit. It rarely gets down to freezing here, but because the humidity is high here, it feels colder than that. So, and we had a stretch where it was only getting up to about 45, 46 during the day, which is quite cold for San Francisco. And generally, it's not that cold here.
Yeah, I think it's a great climate for a clarinet player. No wonder you've enjoyed staying there for so long.
Yeah, well, also the reeds are generally quite stable here because we have a fairly stable humidity. Sometimes, if we get a storm coming in, or if we get a real cold stretch, then we can have a stretch of having problems with reeds, but nothing like, where you are, where it's so dry, which is just, I don't know how people play.
I don't know how people live here, and even though I have my whole life, it's funny. Yeah. Another podcaster that I sometimes chat with online, he has a podcast for contrabass called Contrabass Conversations. Anyways, he recently moved from Chicago to San Francisco, and he's posting every day pictures of himself going running and big smile and T-shirts, and I've learned to hate him as time has gone on.
It's a great place to live, except very expensive. Probably the most expensive city in the United States now.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, and this has been a great conversation, I've learned so much about your barrels and methods and mouthpieces, obviously. A listener question came in about something I also was wondering, and that is, how did you come about the idea for the E-flat clarinet extension? And it's interesting to note that not only has this now extended to the C clarinet, but there's even this nice rubber, red rubber instead of blue, available for this now. What's the story behind this product?
Well, I actually had that idea in the late 80s, but it was for a B-flat clarinet. And the initial idea came from the fact that I play so much bass clarinet, and I just noticed when I was playing bass clarinet, and I have a low C extension, that the B natural was just so nice compared to the clarinet, and I realized it's because the tone was coming out of a tone hole and not out of the bell. And so this was an idea that was just floating around in my head for a long time, but I didn't have the equipment or to experiment with it. And then a friend of mine, David Neathammer, who used to be principal clarinet in the I think it was called the Richmond Symphony in Virginia. We'd been friends for many years, and he called me and he said, "Clark, I've just bought this ancient buffet clarinet, but the bell is too short and it doesn't tune properly. Could you make a bell for me?" And I said, "No." It was a C clarinet. I said, "No, I can't make a bell for it, but I've had this idea for this extension." I said, let me mess around with this. Send me the clarinet and let me mess around with this. I said, I won't charge you anything if you don't like it. So I did just some rough calculations on where to put the tone hole. And the first one, I had the tone hole in the wrong place, but it had a nice sound. And so the second one, I just nailed it on the head. And so I sent it back to him, and he goes, "Wow, this has just completely transformed the instrument." And he says, "And it's a great conversation piece." So I thought, well, I'm not going to make a lot of money making C clarinet extensions, but I wonder if this would work on E flat. So, and by this time I had my own lathe. So I started, running some experiments, and, I just did a few rough calculations for bore, and I think the second one I made played great. And so I thought I've got to start trying this. And for some reason I think I had some work with the opera that I was playing E flat clarinet on. And I took it into the opera orchestra and I stuck this thing, and everybody's looking at it going, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, this is my E flat clarinet extension. Listen to this." And it played really well. And I thought, I think this is something that's commercially viable. So I think it was 2004 when the clarinet conference was in Salt Lake. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to bring 6 of these and just see what happens. And I think I sold all but one of them. I was just astonished. I think part of it, people were just kind of intrigued by the novelty of it. But I would say, well, let's, try your instrument with it and then try it without it. And just the change is remarkable because it really changes the overall sound of the clarinet. And you may or may not like this idea, but I think it changes the sound from an E flat clarinet to just a high soprano clarinet. And it's very much more even. And also now we have the advantage of having a properly placed tone hole for the B natural. So the pitch is much better. Also, even if the tone hole is for your particular clarinet may not be in the right place, you can pull out a little bit and get quite amount of tuning room there.
So it's funny, you raised sort of an interesting point there about someone maybe not agreeing with the concept of sort of tempering the E flat sound. And I was actually going to ask you about that because a lot of people, they're playing Berlioz or something. They want the E flat to sort of bite through the orchestra. But, there's many times where the E flat clarinet is used or misused, depending on your thought, as sort of an extension of the clarinet section's range, which something like this is so appropriate, for balance and blend and tuning and everything.
Absolutely.
I used one of these in a wind ensemble for many years with great success.
Well, if you decide that you want to go back to a sound that is a little more penetrating, just don't use it.
Yeah, remove
but I
it.
found that I'm so used to the response of the instrument with it that I can't play without it. And it also has this added advantage. Now, if you're really tall, this doesn't work, and if you have a long body. But for me, being short, I'm 5'7", I can actually rest the clarinet on my knee because I've got this little bit of extension, but it doesn't bother the sound because it's coming out of a tone hole.
Absolutely.
And so, and then your question about the hard rubber is that so I was making the extensions in Blackwood and Cocobolo, and I was surprised that being that far away from the mouthpiece, how the material influenced the sound, but it did. The Cocobolo being a little bit darker, but there again, we're not using any rings, and I was having trouble with the Cocobolo extensions cracking. So I just thought, why don't I try making them out of rubber? And then by this time I had run into SEM, and they had this beautiful red rubber, and I thought, well, I'll make something that looks like the Cocobolo, but it's red rubber. And it's a little bit different sound. I was surprised at how much more powerful the sound was with the hard rubber extension as opposed to a wood extension. So, so it's just an option. It's a sound option, but those will absolutely not crack. So that's a good advantage.
So the question has to be asked then. So you've made them for E flat clarinet, you've made them for C clarinet, and your first idea was for B flat, but I don't think that one's available yet. Is there a reason? Is that maybe something coming up next, or? Well,
I did make a couple. I've experimented, and I tried about 5 different variations, and they just didn't work. And I found that it was, interesting enough, really affected the pitch and the sound of the throat tones. It made the throat tones very flat. And I think that has something to do with changing the taper where the bell comes in. And I think for the thing to really be effective, so with the clarinet, you probably know this, the bell flare is not just the bell, but it starts at about the FC tone hole, and it starts flaring from there. You can see that when you look in the bottom. Mm-hmm. And I think by throwing the extension in, that it disturbs the vibrating air column too much. I think for it to be effective, you would basically have to make the bore more straight and not flare as much. But then you're talking about a completely different type of clarinet. So there is somebody that's making a B-flat clarinet extension. I think some Italian guy, I saw that somewhere, but it's just because of my experiments and not working very well, I decided to abandon that. I'll tell you this, I am working with a manufacturer on making a new bell.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is going to be a ringless bell. It's primarily designed for buffet clarinets, for the buffet clarinet flare, because this is what I play and this is what most players play. I'm not going to make an option for a lot of different clarinets, but what I am doing is I'm making the bell just slightly longer, because a big problem with buffet clarinets is if you want to play at 440, that B natural is too sharp. Now, I know some people recently have complained that the B naturals on buffet clarinets are flat. I think that's unusual. So this is not a bell that would be a fix for everybody. But for example, in my case, when I play in the San Francisco Opera Orchestra, we play at 440. It doesn't go up from there. And when I'm sitting, on a B natural in a G major, F major concert chord, and I've got the third, which has to be low, I can't do it. So, and it's excruciating. So, somewhat coming up with this bell to solve some of my own problems, but and I think we're going to be able to sell it for about $350.
Oh,
so,
wow!
Yeah, so it'll be a nice little addition to my accessory list.
Well, looping back to your mouthpieces, I mean, you say you're solving your own problems, but I mean, these problems and solutions, extend to other people, right? So I think it's a great way to operate your concept and your business and your design philosophy on a whole. So,
well, I think it's interesting that I've always wanted to do some kind of a history of mouthpiece making in the United States, because I think it's where most of the innovation has happened. I think in Europe, the idea of a handmade mouthpiece in Europe is pretty foreign to them, probably because the market is so dominated by Van Doren. And in the United States, we have this history of individuals becoming craftsmen. And it's been really interesting to see the progress. I should write a little article about this. I mean, I've got something started. But to see the progress of who manufactures mouthpieces has changed. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, the first company that was making a specialized clarinet mouthpiece was a company called, I want to say Goldberg. Is that correct? Anyway, it's the guy who hired Frank Casper to work for him. Goldbeck, Goldbeck in Chicago. And they were a manufacturer of clarinet mouthpieces, wooden, rubber, and metal. And my understanding is they hired the elder Frank Casper to come in and actually specialize in making their metal saxophone mouthpieces. I have an alto saxophone mouthpiece that says Goldbeck, or it says Frank Casper mouthpiece made for the Goldbeck Company in Chicago. And I think that mouthpiece probably dates from about the 1920s. Anyway, so then we start with Casper going into his own business, and he was apparently kind of an amateur clarinet player, but primarily he was making mouthpieces for other people. He wasn't really making them for himself. I don't know how accomplished he was, and if he could test them to a certain point. But mostly he was making mouthpieces for other people, and he was the first, real successful individual mouthpiece maker. And then we get into this period where we get guys like Anthony Gigliotti, Banane, Mitchell Lurie, all these guys that are getting other manufacturers to make mouthpieces in their names to their specifications. That's a whole different thing. And then with Charlie Bay, he's kind of the first guy who's actually a very accomplished clarinet player that's making clarinet mouthpieces. Now, and when we see, a number of people like him come up, Bob Borbeck, but now we're in a time, we're probably in the most fantastic time of mouthpiece clarinet making in the United States, where the guys that are successful, that are making mouthpieces, are also very good clarinet players. Mm-hmm. I mean, think of Richard Hawkins, Brad Bain, myself, Walter Grabner, Mike Lomax. All these guys are really good clarinet players. So it's sort of lent this whole other area of expertise that we didn't have 50 years ago, where you have professional players making mouthpieces for professional players. And it's really an exciting time, I think.
Yeah, I think we have so much technological advancement, not just with mouthpieces, but, the barrels and the materials and the quality of the materials and so many things. We live in such an incredible age. So
yeah, but it's interesting that we're still kind of working on something that hasn't changed too much from the early 19th century.
That is very strange, actually. At what point will it be done?
Yeah, well, probably never. I mean, and also look at instrument manufacturing. I mean, Buffet and Selmer. I mean, what Selmer is doing now with their clarinets is just fantastic. And Buffet is always coming out with new things. So we have this like renaissance of clarinet manufacturing right now that's just really exciting.
Yeah, it's truly unbelievable that just the sheer number of products coming out and the quality and even the affordability is quite amazing.
Right. Well, hopefully, my 10K mouthpiece, the list price is $310. That's a pretty far cry from Brad Bain, who's, I think his top mouthpiece is $700. But hopefully, if we can speed up the manufacturing process, we might be able to lower the price a little bit. But a lot of it just has to do with time and the machine.
Yeah, I think people do, they respect the time and they do appreciate the quality. So I'm sure that there's, a market at many price points actually throughout the range of the products.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we go, you've been so generous as to, on your website for many years actually, you've offered a free debut mouthpiece for any qualified person. Would you tell us a bit about that and how someone could get in touch if they're interested in trying this?
Sure, absolutely. I've done this for years because I believe so much in my student mouthpiece, and I think it's such an advantage for students that you can talk yourself blue in the face about and advertise about how good something is, but until you actually get it in your hands and have your students try it, you may not be a believer. So I've done this for many years. So on my website, on the very first page, you'll see a link that says free debut mouthpiece. So now this is not free for everybody. This is free for qualified teachers. And I'm talking about teachers that teach in the public school system or private teachers that have a large studio. This is not for somebody that, is teaching their kid how to play clarinet. So, but for somebody that is actually interested in trying either the clarinet mouthpiece or the alto saxophone mouthpiece, and they're a qualified teacher, I'm happy to send them a free mouthpiece, no charge. It has to be somebody that's within the contiguous United States. Unfortunately, we don't send things to Canada, I'm sorry, or outside the United States, just because the cost of mailing has become prohibitive. But anybody within the contiguous United States that wants to try my mouthpiece, please, and feel like they're a qualified teacher, go to that link. You'll see that there's a little form that you have to fill out to tell me a little bit about your teaching experience and what you're doing. And that's all you need to do, just a little bit of work, and we'll send you a mouthpiece.
That's fantastic. I'm going to link to that in the show notes. So if you're looking for a way to find that, just head to clarinet.com and search for the show notes for today's episode. I've got one more quick question that just came to me, and then I promise I'll let you go.
Sure.
This is kind of coming from a more nostalgic perspective, like I was talking about before, but that red rubber that you're making the extensions out of, is there a chance we might see that on the mouthpieces too, or?
Probably not, only because from a manufacturing standpoint and from a inventory standpoint, I already have so many different models and facings. It's, I have to think about, because I don't sell most of my products direct, I do sell a few. I have to think about the people that are doing such a fantastic job of distributing my mouthpieces. And if you have too many products, it's just difficult for them to keep all of that stuff in stock. So, yeah, unfortunately, I would say the short answer is no.
Fair enough. Where can listeners find you online?
My website is www.clarkwfobes.com. And just Clark W. Fobes on Facebook as well.
So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I know we went a little longer than planned, and actually I think this may turn into the longest episode yet. And so if you've listened this far, listeners, I thank you for your patience. And I really think that this was a great insight into not only Clark's products, but his sort of working philosophy and his playing and everything. And I hope that we can find a time to have you back again.
Okay, Sean, thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Clarinet Podcast. For free content updates, coupons, and a chance to win giveaways mentioned on the show, please be sure to enter your email address at clarinet.com/subscribe. The podcast is brought to you in part by the generous support of its listeners. If you'd like to learn how you can help out, please see clarinet.com/support. Today's episode was brought to you by D'Addario Woodwinds. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is refining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with the world's most innovative techniques, so you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit D'Addario.com/woodwinds.